every woman that has sex is going to get pregnant, so not every woman is going to get caught, just like every man isn't going to get caught. Go ahead.
I thought she got in trouble because she volunteered it.
And that was the other piece. She actually came forward. So this mysterious Matt that you speak of, if Matt has sex and he goes in there and admits it, well then at that point he's going to be fired because he would have done the same thing that she did. But if Matt doesn't go in there and admit it and they don't find out, they're not going to know. But then again, if Missy gets pregnant or has sex but doesn't get pregnant, they would never know about that if she didn't go in there and tell either, which means it wasn't discrimination because men and women, if the school didn't know, were being treated the exact same way, and if they did know, they would be treated the exact same way. Anybody with any other questions about these? No. Y'all good so far? Let's go into chapter 2. Anything jumping out in chapter 2? And you're stopping the video, right?
Stop it?
Yeah, at 15 minutes?
Yeah, after 15
Okay,
minutes.
good.
Stop
Just
it.
making sure. That makes it a lot easier for me.
Yeah.
And anything from chapter 2? Go ahead.
So does Declaration of Independence just tie into the food?
I think so. I think so. I think that's fair to say. Go ahead.
Stare decisis.
Stare decisis. Go ahead.
The decision stand.
Let the decision stand. And I gave you several examples, but the best way that I introduced this was the tree. Do you remember what I said about the tree?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It's like the abortion law. The longer it stays, the harder it is to take out. So like it's been like, you know what I mean? Like if the law comes to pass like in 3 years, it still can be overturned.
Mhm.
But after it gets older and older, it's harder to get rid of.
Yeah, it's like a tree. You plant a tree, and I asked every class this. Could you pull it out of the ground tomorrow? Could you pull it out of the ground in a week or a month or 6 months? And really, some of y'all kind of look like, I don't know. But to be honest with you, you could. If you let that thing grow for 10 or 15 or 20 years, good frickin' luck. And I had given you the example of abortion. Abortion has been valid law now for 4 decades. It's not, that tree's not coming out of the ground. But the example that I had given you of the flag salute was a little bit different. What was the flag salute case? Go ahead, Amber.
Was it Jehovah's Witnesses?
What about Jehovah's Witnesses?
They didn't want to, because they don't believe in secular things, they didn't want to stand for the flag, like the salute of the flag.
Jehovah's Witnesses did not believe, in fact, that they should have to stand for, or basically, worldly bodies. So they would be pledging allegiance to a worldly body. That's not something that's accepted by the religion. So they refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Do you remember what state it was?
West Virginia.
West Virginia, yes. Beyond is on point with the W's mostly. West Virginia was the state. What happened? The kids, they were suspended by the school because they would not stand for the flag. What was the argument of the school? What was the argument of the kids?
The school said it was unpatriotic, so they suspended him.
The school said, we're trying to teach respect of country, we're trying to teach patriotism, we're trying to teach respect for the flag, this is a sacred symbol. If you're not going to stand, because this has nothing to do with religion, if you're not going to stand for this, we're going to suspend you. What were the little kids' argument?
Freedom of religion.
Freedom of religion. If our religion, and you may not agree with our religion, but if our religion says we do not have to pledge to worldly bodies, then in fact you are violating our First Amendment rights. What did the court say? They needed to do it or not? Because remember, this was in the middle of the Cold War. The beginning of the Cold War.
At first you said that they had to, but then there was like 10 kinds of hell, and you're like, oh no, you don't have to do it.
I like this. Go ahead. 10 kinds of hell. What were these hells that happened?
Like there was some major uproar about it.
What happened to the kids?
They get bit.
What's that, William?
They got beat up.
Some of them got beat up, but there was more, wasn't there?
They got castrated, I think.
I hear you, Beyond's like, castration! Castration. There was one other thing.
Oh, tarred and feathered?
Somebody got tarred and feathered. A lot of the kids got beaten up. One kid even got castrated simply because he would not stand for the flag. How does this relate to stare decisis?
It was like right after that decision was made, so then they overturned it.
Inside of a year on Flag Day, there was another case that dealt with the flag salutes. And in fact, the court came back and said, you know what? We caught 10 kinds of hell, to use your phrase on this, because of all the violence that happened to these little kids that were like 8 and 10 and 12 years old, at which point they struck it down, the flag salute law. And in fact, it is not required for you to do it now. So stare decisis, if you're going to get a case, get it early. Because the longer that it remains valid law, the less likely that it's ever going to be overturned. Abortion has been around 40 years plus. It's not going away anytime soon. It's deep. Its roots are very deep in American life. The flag salute case, on the other hand, they got that about a year later, and they got it early enough so that they could pull that tree out of the ground. I think I had mentioned to you that Obamacare has had a lot of lawsuits. That's why the Republicans keep going after it. Not necessarily because, they're just, frustrating, but in fact because they know that the longer that it stays, they've only got a little bit longer to maybe get this overturned, and it frankly might already be too late on that. What other questions have you got? Go ahead.
What's this Schoolhouse Rock about?
There were 2 Schoolhouse Rock videos. One of them dealt with the preamble, which is "We the People," and the other one dealt with the Declaration of Independence. And it mentions the quotes that deal with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the Declaration. It mentions the "We the People" from the preamble. Make sure you know the difference between the Declaration and the preamble. And that seems like it should be easy, but it gets somebody every time. What else? Yes?
3/5.
What was 3/5?
It was like, it was like 3 slaves was worth, or it was like 5 slaves were worth like 3 people, or was it the other way around?
3 slaves equals
Yeah,
3/5 of the-
3/5. 3 slaves equals 1 person.
Yeah.
5 slaves equals 3 people. 3 slaves equals 5 people. I got all sorts of numbers all over the place right now.
It's confusing now.
Go ahead, Christian.
1 person, 1 slave equals like 3/5.
1 slave equals, wow, that's an even better way of saying it. 1 person equals 3/5 of a slave?
No, 1 slave
Equals,
3/5 of a person.
actually, that's pretty good. Did you want to, okay, yeah, that's actually what it was. And if you remember when they were doing the plans, and we got Virginia plan and New Jersey plan up here. Do you remember which state's plan was based on population? Virginia plan. So the idea was the more people that you had in the state, the more representatives that you would get in the Congress. Well, there was a debate, and this is what I'm bringing back to 3/5. The debate was, how do we count slaves? The southern states wanted to count slaves as people so that they could get more representation. 1 slave equals 1 person. The northern states did not want to count the slaves at all because they didn't have very many slaves compared to the South. They wanted to protect their authority in the government. The compromise was say it again, Christian, I can't do it.
1 slave equals 3/5 of a person.
1 slave equals 3/5 of a person, or 5 slaves equals 3 people for population purposes. So the South got a little bit more representation in the government. The South also ended up having to pay taxes based on the slave population, 3/5. So the northern states got more revenue into the government. They didn't have to pay. The South had to pay it. So neither side got everything that they wanted, but that's where they came about. You notice up here, I think, maybe I don't. I thought somewhere up here, yeah, I do. I've got amendment fractions. What are the fractions that we talked about? There's 3/5, which deals with the slave and representation. What are the other fractions that we talked about?
2/3.
What was 2/3?
Let's start with 3/4.
Okay, what's 3/4?
It's the amount of states that need to ratify an amendment.
3/4 is the number of states that need to ratify a constitutional amendment. So I'm guessing that means that 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate leads to proposing a constitutional amendment. So you need 2/3 vote of House and Senate to propose an amendment, 3/4 of the states to ratify it. There's another reason for 2/3. Talking about checks and balances, separation of powers. Go ahead, Christian. You look like you had something to say.
But I was gonna say, you mentioned something about like in the Constitution they had like I think like 9 of 12 or 9 of 13 colonies that we're definitely gonna say yes. So
Yeah.
They said to that.
The Constitution set it up so that in order to ratify the Constitution, what was the vote that they had to have? 9 out of 13. That's exactly right. So in order to ratify the Constitution, you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree. Ultimately, they got 13 out of 13 states to agree. What did you need in order to pass a law under the Articles of Confederation? 13 out of 13 in order to pass a law under the Articles, because if one state would have said no, then it would have been killed. Let's go a little bit further with this. What was the other example of 2/3?
To override a veto.
2/3 vote by the House and the Senate in order to override a veto. So there's 13 13ths, 9 13ths, 3/4, 2/3, 3/5. Go ahead, Grant.
You said 13 out of 13 states needed to pass a law in the Articles of Confederation.
Had to be unanimous.
Was there a Congress in the Articles of Confederation?
It was just a legislature, yes.
Alright.
Yeah, it was just, they didn't call it the Congress, so I hesitate to put that on tape. But yeah, there was a legislature. Each state had the exact same representation. New Jersey plan. If the Virginia plan was based on population, what was the New Jersey plan based on?
Representatives? No.
Yeah.
Everyone
It
gets
was
the same.
equal.
It was based upon equality. The Virginia plan became what part of the Congress? House of Representatives. The New Jersey plan became what part of the Congress? The United States Senate. And the idea was the big states, the populated states would have an advantage in the House, but in order to get something passed, they would still have to go through the Senate. The little states would have the advantage in the Senate, but in order to get something passed, they would still have to get through the House of Representatives. So that was considered the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. Connecticut Compromise created the bicameral House and the Senate and the Congress. Any other questions that are up here? Yes?
1808.
Wait, sorry, the Connecticut Compromise?
Yes.
Okay.
The Connecticut Compromise. There were two provisions in the Constitution that dealt with slavery. One was the 3/5. Christian, say it one more time.
One slave equals, 3/5 of a person.
One slave equals 3/5 of a person, or 1808. Go ahead.
That's when the slave trade would end.
Yes, they didn't try and end slavery in the original Constitution. What they did try and do was end the slave trade. And the idea was that from 1789 to 1808, the states that had slaves would be free to continue to trade these slaves, import them internationally, whatever the case. However, in 1808, that was supposed to end. And the thought was that if we give the southern states 20 years to be able to get off of slavery, then at that point in 1808, they will have made arrangements, no more slaves will come in, the slaves will die, the institution will go away. What did the southern states do during those 20 years?
They imported like as many as they could.
They imported slaves at levels that we had never seen before, and then they began to trade amongst themselves, which meant that they didn't need the international slave trade. And that 1808 provision actually made slavery, I think you could argue, worse. Any other questions from chapter 2?
Like the ERA?
ERA, what was ERA?
Equal rights amendment.
Equal Rights Amendment. What did we raise that within the context of?
Money.
Money. Gender.
It was like amending the Constitution.
Yeah. So what were they trying to do? Equality of rights shall not be denied on account of sex or gender, if you'll recall on this. This was an amendment that never passed, and beyond, you're right, the idea really was that let's address this within the context of maybe economics, opportunities, money in its most basic sense, but could this have been applied to other things?
Wait, so it never passed?
It never passed. No, it is not law today. Same-sex marriage is something that we had talked about because I think I had mentioned to you, if Adam and Eve can get married wherever they choose and then they move and they're still married, and Adam and Steve can't, that seems to be the denial of equal rights on account of their sex or their gender. So that would be something. I think we had talked in several of the classes about women in the military. That kind of a thing. And I'm not going to look at Karen for any particular reason, but that was something that came up at different points. So kind of keep that thought in mind, maybe that women could be drafted or maybe required to be put in frontline positions. Anything else from this up here as we, yes?
What's the balancing under the flag burning? What are you talking about?
Balancing. If you remember, we were talking about different ways to interpret the Constitution. And I had given you the idea of stare decisis, Remember, let the decision stand at what it literally means, and we've talked about that. Original intent was looking back at the original intent of the framers, and we may get back to that in a second. Balancing was the idea that sometimes you might